Howdy YouTube, it's Dean Snav and I'm coming at you today with a retro format overview and deck list. So with the advent of the Time Wizard format, retro formats are quickly increasing in popularity, and one that I've always enjoyed and hope will reach the heights of Edison and Goat format is the aptly named Nekroz format. If the upcoming Power of the Elementals format is indeed a tier 0 like some are predicting, retro formats might see an even further increased popularity, and I'm going to show off one that I deeply enjoy. So the Nekroz themselves debuted in February of 2015 with the Secret Forces alongside their infamous Brown short print. But the Nekroz format itself refers to April or July 2015, formats for which the cards were available for the entirety of the format. The latter of the two ban lists is also referred to as Clown format, named after the performance engine seen in Clash Rebellions, but existing meta decks continue to be equally viable at top events, and lists for most decks didn't change all that much, besides those that teched in the new engine. Alongside Djinn release or Rituals, Nekroz proved to be an oppressively powerful deck, but remained the most consistent and powerful deck even with the banning of Djinn in July of 2015. All of the old Duelist Alliance meta decks remain good, but Clifforts, Shadows, Telenots, Burn Abyss, and Ritual Beast, which were bolstered by new support, made up the remainder of the Tier 1 alongside Nekroz. Slower or less consistent decks like Volcanic, Six Samurai, Infernoids, Evil Storms, Batterymen, Plant Synchro, and Madolche remained as rogue threats. A deck that bridged the gap between the two is the deck that I personally played and will be showcasing right now, Masked Heroes. The new Masked Hero core debuted in the Hero Strike structure deck, and the deck is characterized by high versatility and consistency, with the trade-off of poor grind games and recovery. Compared to the modern Omni-Hero builds and the Bubble Beat that came before it, it is less capable of OTKing, but is definitely much more consistent as a trade-off. This deck definitely started the trend of a long line of hero decks that could not make a board that Raigeki could not break. Personally, however, I do believe that this deck was underrepresented at the top levels of play, and a skilled pilot could definitely make this a force to be reckoned with, who understands the more nuanced aspects of the format. The deck itself did not change much between July and April 2015 ban lists, and I'll be showing off a list alongside different ways to play this deck. In terms of hero cards, there was indeed one that utilized the Destiny heroes alongside a Plague Spear zombie to make Darklaw plus Synchro monsters that give it better protection. But whilst this deck was seemingly simpler, it was definitely the more consistent and competitively successful way to build this deck. So let's get straight to it. Neos Alias, he is a deceptively powerful card in this format. This is really the last year in which cards like this were really viable in anything. At 1900, he can beat over Denko Sekka or X-Time Knight if your board is pinned under one of them. He can beat over a nerfed Cliffort monster. And if both of you just have an awful hand, you could just summon it and potentially win by beatdown, which is funny. 3 copies of the Searcher card, Shadow Mist. This card is obviously your main target for Darklaw, or in this build, your only target for Darklaw, and is useful in either the deck, hand, or graveyard, so there is no reason not to run 3. He's one of the deck's only ways to generate advantage under its own combos. 3 Bubble Man for Xyz plays. A lot of lists back then didn't like to run 3 Bubble Man, but a 3rd Bubble Man as an additional monster allows you to make more Xyz monsters in the late game and helps with the longevity at the expense of only a little bit of consistency. Double Summon Monk because it was limited, semi-limited, and Double Goblinberg. You don't want to run 3 of this guy because he's not a hero and doesn't do anything on its own, and 1400 is not very good, so he can leave you with a bricked hand, so yeah. Other monsters you could consider running would have been Photon Thrasher, Assault Halberd, and the Thunder King Rao. but none of those really improve the consistency of the deck all that much, and it's pretty good at getting out Dark Law more often than not, so generally don't want to be running those in a competitive build of the deck. You do, however, want to be running the core of this. Pretty much all competitively successful decks ran this, and I fail to see how there could be anything better. Rarely gets you either a hero or a Goblinberg, so it can pretty much facilitate Dark Law if you have one or the other. This is necessary to make Dark Law, and Here Lives gets you Shadow Mist instantly. It is also a good target. All of them are also decent targets for Summoner's Monk. Mask Charge. This is really good, but inconsistent. So at 1, he's perfect because it gets you a plus and a Masked Hero. Especially really good for late game. Mystical Space Typhoon is good against pretty much all decks except Nekroz because they didn't run many traps. But it is a very trap-heavy format overall besides that. So double Forbidden Lance. This card is really good against Cliff Forts, and this card is pretty much good against everything, because even if you aren't being actively targeted by spells and traps, it is a battle trick and can be used to out-problem monsters. There were decks at the time that opted to run the My Body as a shield, but generally it is not necessary, as this can be used during the damage step. And besides Exciton Knot, there wasn't a whole lot of common monsters that destroyed stuff, so that card is just superfluous for this format. One thing that does stop Exciton and a lot of cards is the Forbidden Chalice. Not a lot of decks opted to main deck this, but as a tech option, I really like it because there's no decks that is really bad against except Cliff Forts, which the deck has a good matchup against to begin with. And it helps a lot with your poor matchup of Shadow. It can be used during the damage step. You can use it on your monster or their monster to out a Shadow. You can even use it to stop a flip effect if you wanted. And just even against Nekroz, it can block a Trishula. Against Burning Abyss, you can do some stuff with it. And just remember, if all else comes to fail, you can buff your own monster. Pretty good. Your monster breakers. You could maybe make the argument to side this out for like a 3rd MST or Upstart Goblin. Especially if it's not the format where Djinn is legal, but there aren't many boards where this doesn't work against except towers, or if your opponent has a Gungnir in hand as Nekroz. Even if it's against Burning Abyss, Shadow, or Cliff Fort without towers, and they can come back at you, you can clear the board and make like a Dark Law, and your opponent will have a hard time rebuilding, and this is just always good. One Oasis and Double Call. Some decks opted to run basically 4 Call of the Haunted, but that card doesn't do anything on its own, and it takes a turn to set up, so it's not particularly good against any stage of the game. It's just okay against all of them. The point of this card is that the monster only needs to leave the field for this card to self-destruct. Whilst with this one, the monster has to be destroyed, so it doesn't clog back row or leave an excess card for Exciton Knight to take advantage of. Warning and Vanity's Emptiness. These are your must-run traps during the format. 2000 seems like a lot, especially if Activated Hero lives. But if you block the Rot Summon with Dark Law, this is just a game winner on its own if they don't have anything to get rid of it. And this is just insane. It wasn't uncommon to see just any 2 decks, Gentlemen Agree, to side this out, just like with Djinn and then Mirror Match. The power traps for any deck that runs traps. This is probably the worst one because you don't actually have a way to take advantage of your own monsters dying except Shadow Mist. But it's still really good against turn the tides of the game if you're losing card advantage. This is always good, but this one is probably the best one. It outs Djinn Lock. It outs Dante, Shadow Monsters, and is okay against like Medolches and other rogue decks too. And the 6 Samurai, because they can only negate spell cards. Mirror Force pretty good against BA, especially if they activated all their effects already. And Fiendish Chain against any deck besides Clifford, it slows the game down, so pretty good. For your extra deck, I went with Double Dark Law, Acid. Dropping the Acid with Dark Law up is insane against any deck that affects. Koga outs towers, forces removal because he can just nerf your opponent's monster whenever he battles. Anki, this card combos well with Chalice because you can Chalice during the damage step and he becomes 32. And he can facilitate big pushes by adding a Dark Lob. One thing to note is that this guy's effect does indeed require that the monster hit the graveyard, which hilariously contradicts with Dark Law, but you probably won't have both of them up, so you shouldn't need to worry. Castel, Exton, and Abyss, these are the must-runs of the format for any deck that makes rank 4s. This outs everything. This is both control and assault card, and this combos very poorly with Dark Claw, but if you have a bad hand, you can make it with Bubble Man and buy yourself a turn. Blade Armor Ninja and Excalibur, they're your big pushers, and this also outs towers. Antiluminescent is your only protection, basically. Ragnar Zero combos well with your Forbidden cards and the Koga as a control option. Emerald, he can be used to recycle your cards, which this deck struggles with, and has a decent application where you can actually special summon back your Alias. Dark Rebellion, once again, forces removal, and if your opponent just makes like two big monsters, it can make OTKs or out towers if your opponent is just being dumb. And Cowboy as just a game ender. This deck can indeed deal a lot of damage, but sometimes it is just short of games, so I'm gonna be wary of that. Oops, knocked over the stack of books I propped my phone on top of instead of a tripod. But yeah, there's the main deck, and for the side deck, there's definitely a lot of personal preference, but there are a couple of cards that are just heavily recommended for the side deck in this deck, and I'll debut them here. So this deck's main tailor-made out to the Zinlock is Destiny Hero Doomlord. Compared to the Exiled Force and Bullblader, which were also run, this card can be searched by Shadow Mist, and as a Dark Hero, you can mask change away to make Dark a lot afterwards, even though it does cost you your battle phase, but those other cards cost you your normal summon, and you can't attack the turn either, probably, so doesn't really matter. Plus, this card is okay against like Shadow and Burning Abyss, because you can like banish their monster, and then just they don't get whatever benefit it is, and after that you still get a free turn to play around with, even if they out this card. So yeah, definitely run this instead of Exiled Force or Bullblader. If it was level 4, I'd consider maining it, but it isn't, so really good side card. Other than that, Ptolemos and Constellar Diamond, I can't seem to find mine. But yeah, this is just super good against any deck that it counters, but it does take up 2 extra deck slots, so it's really up to you to determine whether you want to side or main deck this, but it is really good, so you want to have it in one or the other. Max C is good against any combo deck, Nekroz in particular, and Shared Rod, really good against Nekroz, and a thing you can do is you can proactively flip this against Shaddolls, and you can like pop one of their monsters, and they might opt not to run, like add their Shadow Fusion back if they feel like you're up to something, and even then, it's a 1-for-1 trade, it's not too bad. Lastly, Shadow is a pretty subpar matchup, not the worst, so you have your Defusion for that. What is the absolute worst matchup for this deck is Tellarknights, and such. Either and the Ban Played On or Stygian Dirge is pretty mandatory in the event that you run into those decks, as you will have a very hard time without these Floodgate cards. This is a better Floodgate, as they just can't commit monsters to the board at all. Even like after it's just normal summon to Neb, and then they just can't do anything. But it can indeed lock you out of winning quicker and help them find an out. While Stygian Dirge, you can just play under fully, but they might be able to still play depending on how they build their deck. Okay, those are the side main and extra cards, and there are a couple of engines you could opt to run in this deck. Engines that you tech into heroes are generally done to give the deck better longevity in the grind game. And the best example of that would be the Chaos engine. Usually this card is an extra light, and you can banish your Summoner's Monk to make it. And it's a level 4, so it's pretty good. And this is your 1-card boss monster. Bear note that you do have to take cards out of the deck to make these, so it might decrease the consistency or versatility of the deck. But as a late game boss monster, it definitely helps, so you can consider those. The hands, they are super good with Dark Claw if you can somehow get them both up, because this does eat your normal summon. But you will never run out of monsters if you have the hand in your deck. Mystic Tomato, this card is pretty slow, but you can crash it into an enemy monster going second and then just make Dark Law. But running this and then just like turn 1 setting it is just really not good. It was saw play in like the World Championships, I think, because of the composite Banlist just slowed every other deck down. But you can tomato and tomato, and it does get you more monsters, but I wouldn't recommend it. The other side of the hat is Trap Tricks. You could run it in this deck. The Trap Tricks monsters do all eat up your normal summon, but activate a Here Lives, set a trap card, and basically if they have no way to out your Dark Claw with the spell, then you pretty much just won at that stage. Once again, it gives you a higher ceiling, but doesn't improve your consistency much. It wasn't completely unseen. You could run the gadgets, but generally it's subpar to pretty much anything else you could run, so I did see it, but I wouldn't do it. And lastly, when the performances came out, you could try them in this deck. Brilliant Fusion and like a second Alias was also an option, but generally it didn't add enough to justify the extra bricks, so yeah. One deck to consider siding is your Eradicator Epidemic Virus. So basically the play with this is make Dark Law plus Dark Rebellion Xyz Dragon, and then after that you can just declare spell and just wipe your opponent out. Yeah, it's really good, but a lot of the times you can actually really only get one other monster up unless your hand is a Here Lives, Monster, Bubble Man, and 2 trap cards exactly. A lot of the times that isn't too reasonable, so it's not consistent enough to main. Especially going second, you don't really want this, so it is an option, however. Once again, as I mentioned, the deck does indeed lose to the Raigeki. There's really not a whole lot you can do with it. The hero archetype itself doesn't have anything, unlike Nekroz, where had the Gungnir, Shadows had the ability to recover. Whilst this deck just sort of has to take it. You could try the Starlight Road or a Dark Brab. Neither of them is good or consistent enough to justify maining. This is decent in the Shadow matchup. Horrible in Nekroz because like if you stop the ritual spell, they draw 1. They might just get another. But Starlight Road, this is really powerful if you do need to get it off because it turns off one of your weaknesses. But really, you really only want to be siding this out if you think your opponent is, like, they really love going to Exiton. You can make a board to bait them into tricking this. Or if you think they're running 2 Dark Holes for whatever reason, and this is, it's subpar, but it can indeed allow for some fun interactions. And lastly, if you want an extra hero in your deck, you could run Wildheart and his Masked Hero counterpart Dian. Wildheart can be used to storm a set 4 pass board because he's unaffected by traps. And DN can special summon Shadow Mist, get a mask change, and go for like a big push. The problem is Wildheart doesn't do anything on his own, and 1500 is not a useful number, unlike Alias's 1900. Plus, this card, it doesn't really actually solve any problems. It's just a mix between like Anki and Blade Armor Ninja, and Anki can just, whatever this outs, Anki can also, so far. Lastly is your Miracle Fusion. Generally want to be making Ab-Zero with this, because just having this on board, just top decking this late game, that's what this is basically good for. It's to help with the grinding games. Top deck this, make an Ab-Zero, and your opponent is just really pressured, especially if they use like a Raigeki to break your first board. It can be really hard to deal with. But once again, Miracle Fusion decreases your consistency. But on the other hand, compared to your other decks, the other engines, you can indeed pitch it with Shadow Mist. That way it just wastes your extra deck slot. Even in multiples, you can definitely consider running it. Lastly, alongside your Miracle Fusion is the main deck, the main boss monster of the structure deck, Contrast Hero Chaos. It is a game winner if you drop it at the right time. Bear in mind, he can negate any face-up card, not just monster. So like a Torrential Tribute, he can negate it, but 2 Mask Heroes plus a Miracle Fusion is just a pipe dream most of the time, and just that small of a contingency is generally not worth the extra slot in your extra deck. You're better off playing like an extra rank 4 toolbox for it. And lastly, the 2 other options for your rank 4 toolbox is Yaga Samurai, Heartland Draco. So Heartland Draco is actually pretty good, but the deck doesn't run any continuous spells. Also, he is 2000 is not the most helpful thing in this deck. And yeah, so, but if you do run him, you could indeed try Summon Breaker in the main deck or in the side deck, since even if you are limited 3, this deck doesn't special summon that much, and you can actually also mask change during the battle phase for an extra summon, so this is pretty decent in this deck, and it turns this on if you want to run it. Lastly, Samurai. It's a double attacker at 1900, but you can make it with Summoner's Monk as opposed to Warriors. Also, as a bonus effect, if 2 monsters are up and the other monsters, or any number of monsters are up and another monster is attacked, he switches to defense and the attack becomes him. So basically, if your opponent reads their cards, they have to attack this. There's not a whole lot that's good against like a Shadow player with a bad hand, or Burning Abyss player with a bad hand, and like maybe Blue Eyes, but basically he's your pusher with Summoner's Monk. And yeah, so that is your overview of Heroes. It is a very fun deck and a very fun format, and I hope more people will pick up the format in the coming months.